Hey there, I'm Neil. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the host of my new podcast, Pause and Rewind. I'll be chatting to changemakers, thought leaders, and role models who all share a common goal. They're striving to make the world a more inclusive place. And let's face it, we need it. Each guest has a unique story when it comes to doing their thing, and we often know who people are in the now. But how much do we really know about them? Pause and Rewind takes a moment to explore the experiences in my guest's life that led them to where and who they are now. Because everyone loves an origin story. We'll dive into tales, anecdotes, and what makes our guests tick. So, are you ready to pause and rewind? Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pause and Rewind, where I get to sit and chat with an absolute role model, change maker, and really good friend, Jude Guaitamacchi. Jude is an all-round phenomenal human. They're a trans non-binary activist, campaigner, and educator. They're also a public speaker. They've been a model and they do some writing and yeah, they're phenomenal. And I love the work they do. They have recently set up the Trans Solidarity Alliance, and I'm really excited for you to hear more about that. I really cherish this moment to sit and chat with Jude about their story. And we just want to put a trigger warning on this between us to say that we do cover challenging topics during the conversation, particularly around Jude's turbulent upbringing, thoughts about kind of not wanting to be here anymore, mental health. Addiction and recovery. So please take care of yourself while listening to this episode. But you will hear the inspiring way that Jude has come through that, and it's a work in progress to make a difference to other people's lives, and particularly young people, trans people out there. So enjoy the episode and let me know what you think. Cheers. My wonderful friend Jude, thank you so much for joining me on Pause and Rewind.
Thank you so much for having me, Neil. I'm really excited.
Well, you were an obvious guest for me. I can't wait to hear more about little Jude. And I have gotten to know a little bit through our conversation since I met you last year. But yeah, excited to dip into more of your story. But for now, I would love to hear more about what the world looks like for Jude Guaitamacchi right now.
What does the world look like? Well, I've been doing a lot of campaigning and activism work over the years, especially very recently. But I'd say, my life is basically change making that where I can. I'm a speaker, I'm a trans awareness trainer, trans rights campaigner. I'm also the founder of the Trans Solidarity Alliance, which is a new organization set up as a network for collaboration. We've been hosting briefings in Parliament and actually hosted the first ever all trans expert panel in UK Parliament history, which I'm really, really proud of. But I've worked on trans solidarity campaigns over the last 6 years. I was one of the organisers of the hashtag L with a T, Trans People Are Loved. And I continue to kind of create campaigns and kind of work towards change as much as possible for the trans community.
I'm just going to ask a question. Why do you do it?
Why do I do it? To be honest, I think it's a way that I can kind of channel all of the difficulty and the trauma that a lot of not just myself but the community are facing, especially at the moment. And rather than kind of get bogged down with all the negativity, I think I have to find a way to channel it in a positive way. But I also think that for me, my campaigning is also my art in a weird way. I was thinking this today, like like a painter would produce a picture or a musician would produce a piece of, music or for me, I think campaigning is my art, and I've found lots of creative ways to create sort of campaigns and to in a way like use creativity as a message, as a way of leading change as a concept,
Absolutely. And you are so gifted when it comes to breaking it down and understanding what people need to hear, how to bring people along on the journey. You are a communicator, you are an educator. I know that you have stepped away from the education side of things around young people. You still do it through your social channels, but actually going into schools. I know through talking to you what a hard decision that was, and but how much pride that brought you, and the feedback from the young people that you educated. Are
Oh
you
my God.
missing it?
Yeah, I am actually. It was something that brought me so much joy over the years. And actually, it's something that I almost fell into and just sort of happened on its own. And I actively wanted to work with children in schools to kind of inspire and empower and help them along their journey because I recognized that actually that's what I needed when I was younger. And it's interesting because my journey into education wasn't through anything LGBT related. It was actually through the Amy Winehouse Foundation, and that they're a charity that I actually sought to work with because back in my mid-20s, I I was in recovery. I had been for a number of years from addiction and alcohol misuse, and actually I wanted to bring some inspiration to children that were battling, but also with their mental health, with struggles. And I felt at that time that I'd found the answer to dealing with a lot of those issues and a lot of freedom. And it's interesting because we ran something called the Resilience Program, and I was visiting a lot of schools and being very honest and open with all young people. And it's just in the last 11, 12 years that that work really developed as I went on my own journey of like self-discovery, and I peeled the layers of the onion to kind of really discover more about myself. And I brought that part of my experience with me into schools, and very naturally that sort of delved into more LGBTQIA plus and trans awareness topics because that being a more recent side of my experience, and also because it was so needed, right? And like, most of us that come from my generation and before grew up with Section 28, so a law which actually prohibited kind of learning or even really talking positively about LGBT topics, and especially in school, specifically in school. And so um I recognized that that was also something that young people needed, and how beneficial it would have been for me to have learned about myself at a much earlier age rather than having got to the age of 30 and then realizing I was trans, because that was really so much to do with my mental health recovery as well, actively like self-seeking and learning more about myself. And this was such a deep and so, kind of core experience that had gone unexplored for so many years, and it was pivotal in my recovery journey, in my kind of healing journey. And it hasn't been easy, but for the last sort of 6 years, especially, but 10 really. So I actually delivered my first LGBT presentation 10 years ago, but then as I realized I was trans 6.5 years ago, I brought that side of my experience, and I've really actively sought to educate and support trans youth in the United Kingdom. And I feel like, I've left all of that behind, and it's really it's tough, because
Mm.
I that gave me so much. It really enriched my life, that side of my career.
And you've made such a difference. You regularly have shared the impact that you sharing your story, standing in front of young people and its impact, and you've given them a role model, you've given them inspiration, and you've given them a feeling of belonging, and it's beautiful. And just because you've stepped aside from that, that impact will still continue in many of those young people's lives. Why is this so important right now, Jude? We're coming up towards an election. We've got the first ever Trans History Week, right? This episode is going out during Trans History Week. You are a bloody trans history maker yourself, like with your campaign and activism. You know that I love the work you do. Solidarity Alliance is, doing things that have never been done before. Why is this all so important right now? And why should other people get on board?
Do you know what? I feel like we are like almost 6 years too late, right? Like I remember my early days in campaigning. Like I just living the living life as a trans person is like a what do they say? It's a form of activism in itself, right? It's resistance within itself. And I came out 6.5 years ago. I experienced for the first time what it was like to exist as a trans person, and it was such a different experience for me. And because I was very centered around a community group in Brighton, I became immersed in kind of the world of direct action activism, and a world that I'd never known before. Like I wasn't very political. I wasn't very informed when it came to those topics. Like my background was like mental health and substance misuse and addiction circles, and kind of working in that field. And then all of a sudden I'm kind of delving more in a kind of political space, and I learned a lot in those early days, but along with that, I was also presented with all this like collective trauma and all of these things that were going on, like anti-trans groups that were, hosting meetings all over the place and very kind of a community that wanted to kind of be seen and be heard and we really worked together to facilitate a lot of protests and, as I said, direct action kind of protests, but also developing kind of safe spaces as well. And over the years, I have really gone on a journey in terms of my activism and what that's looked like because I have been directly directly witnessed how these groups kind of work, and it's been so interesting. Like I'd say, back in 2018, the wider population had never really heard the term TERF, like trans exclusionary radical feminist, but it's a word that we knew very well. And I'd say that most people hadn't had a look in to what we were experiencing up until an anti-trans group hijacked the front of the London Pride Parade. And it was in that moment that those groups really made themselves very visible. Somebody said to me, actually, the TERFs have made themselves famous. And in a way, they really did, because over time, more and more people became aware of these kinds of groups. And they've also been working with a strategy, right? So they've been working in a specific way, and a lot of that has been kind of entering political spaces, hosting briefings, talking to politicians, and also putting out a lot of misinformation, using their platform to put out a lot of misinformation, which is mainly circulated by our media. And so over the years, what we've seen is this kind of like this huge amplification of anti-trans rhetoric, in all of those kind of areas. And of course, with that, the general public are also, subject to only accessing that kind of information and also falling prey to that strategy. And we've seen a decline in support for the trans community actually, and we've lost allies. Like we've seen that there was a study that was done to show that more and more people are actually unsupporting, not supporting trans people anymore, which is really alarming. And then we're seeing a lot of that anti-trans rhetoric in public, in government documents, right? Like the Department of Education document actually had the words gender ideology in, and that just, to me, that's a reflection of how far these groups have gone in and how successful they have been in driving forward their agenda. And on the kind of flip side of that, I feel that, having been involved in a lot of direct action stuff, which, there's a place for all forms of activism. I will never kind of say that there is a right or wrong way, but I feel like there was definitely a need for something like the Trans Solidarity Alliance, for an organization that specifically worked in a similar way in entering those kinds of spaces, in trying to engage the political leaders, in trying to kind of really focus on how we drive forward a more positive media narrative. And I know that there's lots of organizations that are doing that kind of thing, but I think with TSA, what we're aiming to do is bring a lot of those organizations together in order to collaborate and work together, because really we are stronger, when we work together, rather than having lots of individual groups kind of doing a similar thing. So the hope is that this will kind of be a vehicle in order to really specifically focus on where we can implement some of a strategy in improving, the climate in the United Kingdom for the trans community.
Fantastic. Well, I'm so excited to see what the Trans Solidarity Alliance does next. Marty, who's a good mutual friend of ours, founder of Trans History Week, was telling me about the next parliamentary panel that she's chairing. And so yeah, it's all so exciting. Before we dive into your origin story, how can everyday people, support Trans Solidarity Alliance, but also show up for the trans community?
In terms of the Trans Solidarity Alliance, I will say that our group, although we have some cis people working with us, some incredible people who have been mentors and act, the wonderful Nancy Kelly, for example, who's just been incredible and offered so much support. But we need more Nancy Kellys. We need more people that are willing to kind of show up for us and help us and be that vehicle that we need. I'd say trans people lack a sufficient platform, or the means or the visibility to kind of be seen and heard. And that's where cis people have the power. And so
Mhm.
we need that kind of support. I'd say that a lot of us are actually, putting almost too much into our own projects to support ourselves. And what we need to see are more allies kind of taking the workload for us. I find myself like regularly burning out because of the amount I put into these projects. And so I think regular day-to-day people, in terms of the Trans Solidarity Alliance, I mean, actually we could do with people to invest in our organization. So we're not just putting, our time and effort, so we can invest in certain aspects of developing this organization so it can do what it's designed to do. So that's something we need. But I think in general day-to-day life, what's difficult is I think that it's hard to engage allies like to help us to make effective change. I'd say a lot of people say they support and accept the trans community, but right now that's not enough. It's
No.
not enough because things are going so rapidly backwards that we need to see people putting on much more work. Like, on average, trans people make up 1% of the population. We need our 99% to be on board to help us
Yep.
right now. And so it doesn't just involve kind of interrupting someone when they're being transphobic. It's actually getting involved in what's going on at the moment, because it is so drastically difficult and there is, yeah, like I said, so much is going backwards and not forwards. And so we need support with that.
Yep. Show up, listen, share, challenge, do
Completely.
all the things. It's about action. Allyship is action, whether that's donating, whether
Mm.
that's bringing a trans speaker on board, increasing visibility. Absolutely. Jude, thank you so much. Are you ready to pause and rewind?
Let's do it.
Let's do this. Take me back. Tell me all about little Jude.
Oh, little Jude. Well, I was actually born in Italy when I was younger, and I lived there until I was 5. So I lived with both my parents. My mum brought me over to this country when I was 5 years old. She is English, so I'm half English, half Italian. And I remember coming over to this country and not speaking a word of English at all. And I was put in a school, and I remember not being able to communicate with the other kids, which was a bit of a strange experience. Although at 5, I picked up the language quite quickly, but um, life was kind of a bit all over the place, and it always has been. So even from a young age, my mum sort of took me around to quite a few different locations. I only stayed in the first place we were in England in Suffolk for like a couple of years, and by the time I was 8, we were in London. Every couple of years we moved about, and I'd say that life was quite unstable. There was never kind of a stable home or environment. I never had like friends for any more than a couple of years, and that's kind of been a bit of a reoccurring theme throughout my life into my adulthood, actually. But life was chaotic, quite honestly. I spent a lot of time with living with other people because my mum had to work really hard or she couldn't kind of really live with me because back in the 90s it was a tough time for single parents and my dad didn't pay any maintenance, so it was a case of like mum had to move to London to kind of keep us alive, and then I'd be sort of in the care of either friends or babysitters or au pairs or whoever. So life was kind of quite isolating when I was younger. I didn't have a lot of like family around me. I saw my dad in the holidays, but it was very isolating. And I think when I think back at like my journey with myself and my gender, like I remember those early years, like just feeling like I belong with the boys, but it was never really like a question of like, oh, I'm a boy or I'm not a girl. Like it was just like I'd hang around with the boys, we'd play football, we'd climb trees, we'd swap football stickers, and I just belonged there. And that was never really questioned until I got to sort of 6, 7 years old, where I began to stand out a bit. And I'd say that's where the teasing really began, like when I got a little bit older. And it was more prevalent when I started secondary school at 11, and I started a school with none of my friends, they for some reason split up all our friendship groups, and I was put in a class on my own. And this is back in 1998. And I was just picked on. I was picked on for being different. I was picked on because I presented or acted more masculine. And like, the kind of names that were thrown at me could have been considered as transphobic and homophobic in nature. But, at 11 years old, I hadn't really questioned my identity. And so I remember asking my mum what lesbian meant because someone had called me that word and I didn't even know what it meant. And so, I remember at that time, not only was I being bullied, but I was quite an anxious kid. Like I'd become very anxious because we'd never had a stable home. And then all of a sudden, I'm being bullied just for being myself. And I developed quite high anxiety as a result. Um, and I didn't have a very emotionally kind of warm and stable home either. So I was just constantly on edge, I'd say, and sort of finding ways to cope. For me, I just sort of zone out of reality. Like I remember just spending a lot of time in my head, and that's where I felt safe. And I found my education quite challenging. I couldn't pay attention at school. I always felt like really um like very, very anxious, like round the clock. And so, I kind of and I'd because I'd struggled with the language at a young age, I think there were some barriers in terms of being able to learn and the way that I'd actually learned to learn. Um, and so those early years were definitely very challenging, like very challenging. And again, I hadn't really questioned anything around my gender. It was a lot about survival in those early years. And it wasn't until I began to form attraction to people that then I realized that I was attracted to girls and was like, I remember swearing to myself that I'd never tell a living soul because I was too afraid of, again, being ridiculed for that. Right. So I kept that for myself for quite a few years. And it wasn't until I got to 14 and I actually moved back to Italy at that time. I decided to go and live with my dad because life with my mum was quite challenging. I was never very, very close with her. And I'd always seen my dad as like the fun guy, the guy that kind of took me out for pizza, put me in front of horror movies. Back then, didn't realize that was kind of, the horror movie thing and like the part-time dad thing was just like it was
Mm.
easy to be a part-time dad. But moving back to Italy with my dad was just a real experience because Italy was so very different back in 2001 than the UK, especially at school. And having come from like quite what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of I'm looking, when things are like repressed, basically, repressed English culture, right? Where
Hmm.
people don't really talk about their emotions a lot. Like it was, things were kind of very straight-laced at school, whereas school in Italy was wild. Like kids were smoking in the corridor at like the age of 14 and it was allowed, right? You could smoke in
Right.
the corridor. That was the kind of
The
environment.
joys of European lifestyle.
Oh my God. You're stuffing your cigarette. So of course, like this was a bit of a playground for me, right? I was 14 years old. I'm starting at
Yeah.
school and I've got access to everything, drink, drugs, whatever I want. And of course, within like a few months, because I'm also desperately wanting to fit in and finally have like a group of friends, I automatically succumb to peer pressure. But I'd say more so, I use it as a bit of an opportunity to recreate myself. So to become a person that I felt everyone else wanted me to be. Also to have that validation. So obviously
Mm.
smoking and doing all the other stuff like went alongside with that. So I created a bit of an image of myself that was more feminine, that was more like complete like facade.
Okay.
And yeah, I went a bit wild throughout my teens, basically, Neil, very
Okay.
wild. Didn't spend a day like, well, I say that I did actually study more in Italy because they give you more of a sense of responsibility. But yeah, it was a wild time, basically.
Did some of the anxiety, it doesn't sound like it was belonging in the true sense of belonging, but did some of that anxiety dissipate because you'd kind of assimilated?
Well, I've always described it as this, right? Because I used to tell, before I told my trans story, I used to tell this story. But all I really did was put on a mask. And
Mm.
actually, what I was carrying around was like a pressure cooker of emotions just waiting to explode, right? I was
Yeah.
just like not showing that true sense of self and therefore kind of keeping it to myself and desperately trying to keep a lid on
Yeah.
it. And I think for me, the anxiety never really disappeared.
Just
I just learned to avoid it and I'd
yeah.
learned to mitigate it as well.
Yeah.
And I'd learned to
Okay.
find ways to escape it.
Yeah. As many of us queer people. have done, do. When did it explode?
Oh, it started exploding as soon as I touched any kind of substance. And I think as much as it was kind of medicating it, it kind of I lost all my inhibitions and I was doing very like I was engaging in a lot of risky behavior from quite a young age. And it was a bit of a path of self-destruction. I think I wanted so desperately for especially my parents to kind of save me and love me and give me everything I ever needed. And what's really interesting is I kind of talk about this journey, but I was so unaware of the dysphoria that I must have been
Yeah,
experiencing at that age as my body was changing. Like, that must have been a lot to do with it as
yeah,
well, right? This
yeah,
and so that pressure cooker was kind of exploding and I was constantly putting a lid
yeah,
back on it and I'd say I kind of managed to carry on for a few years, like going to school, but I was kind of like I was basically medicated on weed from morning to night every single
yeah,
day from 14
yeah.
on until 17, and then finding harder stuff and doing that and just not showing any kind of regard or care for myself. So it was kind of sad because I'd learned to like, I'd almost felt like I'd been kind of like neglected in my childhood, and then I went on to like abandon myself as I grew older, and that became a habit of mine, which is very unfortunate. I had mad crushes on probably all my best friends that I couldn't talk about, right? Because I was keeping that
Yeah.
side of myself to myself. And so I was like, I had a lot of shame. I had a lot of internalized shame that I was masking. And it kind of got bad. It got bad in my late teens, I'd say. And I did move back to the UK when I was 17. And I always had the intention to want to really do well and try my best at school. But I just couldn't keep it up. I could never keep it up. Like, no matter how hard I tried, it just reality became intolerable, and so I was constantly trying to escape from it, basically. Yeah.
When going through all of that, without the maturity, without the clear head, and without the language and terminology to kind of like make a difference to yourself, what was the moment that it kind of came out where you realized this might be what this is all about?
What, and so like this might be what might be
I mean, in terms of kind of like gender journey,
gender
when
took
did when
gender took
did the,
ages. It took
yeah,
absolute ages. Yeah. So like late teens, I mean, trigger warning, right? Because it got to a space where I was so unhappy that I don't want to be here anymore. And so,
right,
it got to a point where I fractured my skull. I lost my sense of smell. This is all at 18. I spent some time, my mum and no one was like coming to save me. And even
right,
before I exhibited this kind of behavior, actually, the more people just distanced themselves. So what I found is that I found myself kind of alone, spending a lot of time with people doing similar things, like not having a roof over my head. This is like late teens-ish. So things got that bad at one point. But luckily for me, I had some family friends that took me in, I think at 19, and tried to get me on my feet. And I remember at that point, like again, I try again. And it wasn't until for me, the journey really started when I was finally actually helped with my mental health. And for me, I was lucky enough to have had a long lost family relative because my mum was adopted and she found her dad the year that I was quite unwell, and he sort of stepped in to find the means to put me in a treatment center. So I was in treatment at 20. And I went to my first rehab. I've been to three in my time, but that particular one kind of introduced me to the language of psychology and understanding human behavior and my own behavior. And I'd never, I was terrified of like vulnerability and honesty and openness. Like I didn't talk for the first 2 weeks in that place because I was so terrified, because if once all my coping mechanisms were taken away from me, I went completely mute. Like I was like, I don't know how to talk to people. I don't know how to look people in the eye. Like that's how bad it was without, the ways in which that I coped. And so over time I learned it was just as basic as just like opening my mouth. And this is all relative because that was the beginning of the journey, right? Like for anyone that's been in therapy, a therapist will ask you how you're feeling, and that actually is the process of becoming vulnerable with another person, and that vulnerability introduces us to our authenticity because we're becoming like honest and open about how we're feeling. And so that journey over the course of 10 years brought me to this journey with my gender. And there were so many layers to work through for me, like trauma, what happened, in my, and having to experience the world and understand myself at much deeper level. And for me, it really took kind of exploring certain circles because the queer world was never part of my world in my 20s, not really. Like I kind of went in and out of the closet with my sexuality. Like I was working in the media in my early 20s, and I just remember hearing like people tell kind of homophobic jokes sometimes, even though they were like even gay guys telling like lesbiophobic jokes, and it
I
just
mean,
did not encourage me to
nice to
become.
see nothing's changed, right?
I know, and it's just like, they could be a gay guy, but then
Yeah.
I had this experience I was too afraid to disclose in the workplace because I was like, they're taking the mick out of lesbian shoes. It just it didn't feel comfortable for me to be myself at work. So I kind of tried to keep it to myself for a long time. And then sort of slowly came out, even though I was kind of out in other areas of my life. So I was in and out of the closet for a while. But I think anyone that kind of explores their identity, it becomes a case of like making a choice, right? You make a choice to either hide in the closet and live for everybody else. And some people have to do that because it's safer, right? Like
Mm.
some people don't have the option to come out. And
Yeah.
I always think that's really important to recognize because there should never be any pressure. And this kind of happened in the time that I was ready to be open about my identity. And when I was finally ready, I'd made the decision to kind of step into the world as myself and reveal a side of myself that would then open me to the potential of discrimination and bullying and even rejection from family. I mean, that can happen. That's a huge choice to make. But for me, it was the difference between living for everyone else or living for myself. And it was the living for myself part that became, how I eventually became my true and authentic self. But initially, it started with my sexuality and getting comfortable with that and getting comfortable with communicating that. And then over time, I went on a social transition without even acknowledging that that's what I was doing. But I was, I cut my hair a bit shorter again. I started like putting suit jackets on. So I was presenting a little bit more masculine and exploring what felt comfortable to me in terms of what I like to wear and how I like to present. Um, and then it wasn't until I was introduced to more of a sort of gender diverse world that I truly began to understand that part of my identity. But that it was very complex as well in itself. And I suppose in a way, like I did over the years, what a person could now do on TikTok, right? Which is see a trans person, hear them speak, relate to them, identify with them, and then acknowledge a part of yourself through that experience. Like I did that in a physical way. And so, but then understanding what my gender means to me and slowly but surely growing into that person. And I'm probably still growing into that person today.
Thank you so much for sharing. There's a lot there. Are you happy for me to dive back into family?
Absolutely.
Um, we're not all blessed with the families that we deserve. Chosen family, for many of us, is everything. I know that's the case for you, as well. When it comes to your healing, have you been able to broach this topic with some of the hurt, the feelings of not belonging, the
Mm.
moving around all the time? Have you been able to broach that with your family, or is it something that you've just had to accept?
Do you know the heartbreaking part of healing is the realization that you can't necessarily change the past or change your family as well. And
No.
sometimes putting in strong boundaries is a form of self-protection, even with those that have put you on this earth, right? And it's
Hmm.
kind of a bit of a heartbreaking truth and reality. And I feel like it's an experience that a lot of people experience in this community. Um, I had to make the tough decision of looking at what it means to take care of myself. My relationship with my mum did improve. It's always been a bit hard for me because my history has been my history, and and I'd say as much as I was able to kind of deal with that when I was before my transition in a certain way, like I feel like there's so much more to do. It's interesting because the process of like aligning to your true self or what we describe as like gender affirmation or transition is really an alignment to self. It's like living for the very first time. I feel like I've only recently arrived on the earth. Like it's such a bizarre experience. Like my previous self didn't really experience or learn all the lessons that I needed to, and I feel like I'm doing things for the very first time as my true self. And I think that there's a need to kind of go down the road of healing and looking back at my past, which is why it was quite refreshing to be talking about it now, because actually nowadays all I talk about is my trans journey and not my human journey and my childhood, which is something that I used to talk so much about. And so I definitely think that there's a need to do more. There's certainly more to do. And I think I have an opportunity now to actually explore that as my true self. But this shared experience that we do all have, I think, you know, finding chosen family and finding people in my life who I consider family, who love me and who I love, has really, I mean, they're why I'm here today as far as I'm concerned. You know, they honestly get me through. Like my best friend Liz is like, you know, she's like my soulmate. Like I just feel attached to her in ways that, in a platonic way, in ways that I've never felt with my own family. And I know that we're always going to be in this together. And she's had her own hardship with family and, you know, and in her history, but we have this kind of commonality, this shared experience, and it helps me not to feel alone in the world. But I've got a lot of friends that I have that with, you know, Marty, yourself, even Nancy Kelly. I mean, she's just been such a wonderful addition to my life recently. But these are all people that when things get tough or something happens, that I can call day and night and are there for me and who I'm there for. And I'm just so grateful for that.
I love that. Chosen family is really is everything to many of us, and thank you for sharing because I know it's not easy, you know, and having had my own issues with my own mum, I yeah, it resonates with me. Jude, when we think about your career, kind of now you've got this career in inclusion and activism, but what happened next? You know, you've been to rehab, you've done a lot of healing, you've gone through therapy. What was the bit that you kind of like first edged you into a career doing what you're doing now?
Um, I think, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I described my career before I was trans, and it was similar to the one I have today, but it just, you know, the way that my public speaking just focused on a different topic.
Mm,
However, the goal was the same, right? I still wanted to inspire and empower the future generations, and you know, and help them on their journey to being themselves, being authentic. And that's just translated more to, you know, the trans community now. Um, and so like I'm still doing what, or I've still done what I always set out to do. What I see that as my passion, you know, is to try and kind of pave the way um for the younger ones, and kind of try and like create a world that we needed, the kind of world that we needed, which is a really tough thing because we're nowhere near what we need to see in the world. Like, and in fact, things are going so, like I said, so rapidly backwards that it scares me sometimes. I feel like we're heading towards the Section 28 generation,
mm,
but I don't think we will truly head back into a Section 28 generation just because we're living in a completely different time, right? Like back when I was young, access to information was scarce other than within education and what we were seeing on our four channels on TV. Whereas today, like we do have access to the internet, we've got social media. There are so many other ways that people can access information about themselves, access community, and I think that that will be really helpful for people. The reason that I do what I do, I think it's just my life's purpose. And I think it has become my entire life, which I don't necessarily think is healthy. I think that I remember I having a life before, like having time for, you know, socializing and friendships and travel, but things that weren't just centered around being trans. Whereas I feel like my entire life, including my social life and a lot of the holidays that I might go on. Like it's all just centered around depicting my trans experience throughout it all. Like it's just still all related to just me being trans. Like I've almost become a commodity. Like I don't I feel quite I don't feel like my human self anymore, if that
yeah.
makes sense.
Do you feel kind of a bit of a love-hate relationship with that? Because I imagine on the one hand, it's a lot of it's the reason that a lot of your relationships have developed with people, right? It's a lot of the opportunities that have had, it's carved out this career. But on the other hand, it's like, for fuck's sake, I just want to live a normal life.
Kinda. And I do question, I've said this to Marty before. I'm like, what who would we have been if we weren't trans? Like, you know?
Right.
that has become our identity
It
being professionally.
becomes inseparable, right? It just becomes inseparable.
Yeah, I do. I do actually. I'm because I feel that I got an inkling of that at one point in my career, and that was more during lockdown and just as we came out of the lockdown. And we were discussing this at an event the other night, how, in 2020, 2021, it was far more positive for trans professionals. Like we were actually including it in campaigns, but like it felt more positive and more tolerable and more enjoyable. Like I was doing an acting course for like a year, I was exploring the world of acting. I was doing more castings and commercials. And yes, I did bring my trans side of my experience into it, but it wasn't as traumatic as it is
Mm,
today. So it was something that was more pleasurable. Like I had more positive experiences in schools. I wasn't getting, any kind of interference. You could open a newspaper, put on a TV, or do whatever, go on social media, and there wasn't so many traumatic stories about the trans community or anti-trans media. It was just easier and more pleasurable and fun. Like, stepping into like a more creative world and representing the trans community and in a more positive way. That was fun. Now it's trauma day in,
yeah,
day out.
yeah.
And I don't think any of us were kind of equipped to be able to deal with.
No.
And and that's why it's become a lot harder, I feel. But yeah, sure, I wish there was more time to be human. But I really struggle. I know that some people do switch off and take care of themselves and have some kind of life outside of this all. I'm not one of those people. I wish that that's something I could do. I think I'm going to have to put stricter boundaries, which again I find it hard to switch off. I think a lot of us, when we see a negative story, we can go down a rabbit hole or
Mm.
find ourselves wanting to create or do something. Like I find myself whenever something happens, like I get straight into campaign mode.
But
We could do this or we could do that.
yes.
You know it. I'm on the computer trying to make it happen.
But
Oh,
you counteract the way you counteract has shifted, as you said earlier, the way that you started off in this activism and it was one way and now you're sitting another way. You are choosing to counteract in such a Marty talked about this the other day where listening to Joe Lycett talking about pro things rather than become anti things, you become pro. You counteract with love, you counteract with joy.
mm. Yes, and that's such an important part of this journey for me because I remember in those early days, I'd turn up to a protest with my shirt off, with "I exist" on my chest, with the banners and everything. And we managed to facilitate some some parades like with LWT that were really positive in nature. Things became more tense in the community though, and I personally witnessed that a lot of tension, a lot of kind of infighting, a lot of people. The reactivity just overwhelmed us at one point,
Yeah,
which was understandable because things were very tense, and these groups were purposefully gaslighting us. They wanted these kinds of reactions, and they'd
yeah,
find plenty of ways to get them. So if anything, I feel like my reactivity was being used against me, and my heightened emotions were actually being kind of, stirred up by these people because then the following day after a protest, they got to kind of, leak out stories as to how, aggressive we were being. I remember being directly involved in what was meant to be like a solidarity protest with six different groups that we'd kind of brought together to an anti-trans meeting. But they used to like host a lot of their meetings in quite like sensitive kind of areas and places, like buildings that were set up to kind of support people, like kind of domestic violence buildings, or the Grenfell Community Centre, or somewhere that was, and they'd only release the coordinates or their location at the very last minute. So when activists turned up to these spaces, they could do this whole like they could go into that kind of victim mentality of like,
yeah,
these trans activists are like trying to taunt us and being so aggressive, and that's what would end up in the media the following day. And I remember being involved with one particular protest that then the following day a news outlet reported. I think the words were violent trans thugs or something to that effect. It definitely had trans thugs in it, and I just remember thinking, wow,
right.
we've played into their hands. And I remember in that moment telling myself that I will never play into their hands again, ever. Like I felt a sense of complete, like almost responsibility, which I understand it isn't, but in some way, like I felt that me turning up and, I have a sense of responsibility. I
Yeah.
have a sense of responsibility. I represent my entire community because, and when these stories go out in the media, they land in the hands of, parents of trans children,
Yeah.
across the country, and that makes me feel like I have a sense of responsibility to
Yeah.
think about my actions. And I'm not saying this to anybody else. I'm saying this for myself. That's just how I've chosen to conduct myself. So now I try very hard to really think about how I protest and my personal activism. And so I wanted to find ways that wouldn't play into their hands, that they couldn't, use against us, and using love and positive messaging was a great way of doing that.
You can definitely see how it shaped you, and how it's been an evolution of Jude and the way you show up for your community and for yourself as well. Like no one can argue with the fact that I'm sure people will fucking try, but trans people are loved, right? You can't really argue with that, can you? Same as the messaging behind Trans History Week. Trans people have always been here. You actually can't argue with that because it's shown through history. But you can definitely see that evolution. Final question for this segment, Jude. What are you most proud of today?
What am I most proud of? Do you know what? Like I'm proud that no matter what, I keep trying, because this road for me has by no means been linear in any sense of the word, like even in terms of my recovery. And that's a hard truth. Like I'm still friends with people I was in rehab with 17 years ago that have 17 years of recovery. And I whoop them and I'm so happy for them. I'm humbled in the sense that like that's not been my journey. But every single time I've picked myself up and I've dusted myself off and I've kept trying, not just in terms of this, but all the challenges that I've faced along the way, because there's been many. And I'm proud that I no longer berate myself for that. Like I don't think to myself, I've failed. I haven't failed. Like every part of this journey has been learning for me. And I'm noticing myself coming into myself, because I brought a lot of self-defeating behaviors with me from my childhood, not feeling good enough, not feeling capable, like, that internalized shame has come with me. And I'm still working on that. I'm still trying to step into my power so I don't kind of carry out those behaviors anymore. I still do sometimes in relationships with people. Like I can, not think I'm good enough, or not speak my truth, or not put boundaries in that I need to put in. And that can be really detrimental to me. And I've got a lot to work on, but I'm aware of it all and I continue to work. And I'm hopeful that one day that I will be a much more well-rounded individual. And I'm sure I will be, because, the difference of, if I was to give up on myself, that's for me the kind of end point. But like I haven't, and that's what I'm proud of, the fact that I will never give up on myself and I will keep trying. And, I know that's that kind of quite about self-centered, like I'm talking about me,
Hey, this
but
is your story. This is
well,
your
it's,
story, Jude.
I don't want to say like, I don't want to say like I have helped so many people and so many kids. Like I'm sure I have, and that's great. And I am on some level proud of that. But it's the work that I'm doing on myself that, that I'm really proud of right now, because it's not easy. And actually when I'm very good at losing myself in the work in helping others. And I think that sometimes that can be really unhealthy for me. And so actually what I'm proud of is my learning to try and help myself, because I think the one person that has needed it throughout my life that I haven't necessarily shown it to is myself. And so I'd say that's something that, yeah, that's something I'm still working on, but I'm getting there.
You're getting there, and it's a work in progress. And you are so loved, and you have tons of people who are rooting for you. You're such an inspiration to so many people.
Oh, thank you, Neil.
The House of Happiness is London's ultimate sober clubbing extravaganza. We're led and delivered but created for all, whether teetotal, sober curious, or just taking a booze snooze. We love a day rave, and on a Saturday afternoon you can expect banging house tunes, DJs on decks, dancers on podiums, and a fully stocked alcohol-free bar. Flamboyant, bold, with a glitter station to boot. We're all about safe, inclusive fun, and we even have a pre-meet so that you can make new sober buddies before you hit the dance floor. Grab your tickets from Instagram now at House of Happiness Official, and we'll see you on the dance floor. Are you ready for some quick fire questions?
Go for it.
Okay, What's an album, book, or movie that's had a lasting impact on you?
Groundhog Day, the movie. I have watched it like Groundhog Day, and I can continue. I'll never get sick of that movie. And I like the idea of um, the fact that we can repeat the same day over and over again, and repeat things over and over again. But one day, by improving ourselves, our lives can change and things can change. That's the message I get from that movie. So I find it quite inspiring, and I love it.
Marty, interestingly, said Groundhog Day the musical.
That's
You
so
in
interesting.
you in sync. What day would you want to repeat?
Well, you see, it's interesting because I feel like it's a bit of a reflection on the way we can live our lives, actually. And so, the repetition of the day is the repetition of the patterns, I think. And I repeat a lot of patterns yearly. Liz reminded me this morning, she's like, you live with patterns that you repeat over and over again.
Yeah,
But
you're like,
yeah,
thanks for that, Liz.
think about this. Do you know what? The day that I'd repeat, actually, and I know this is a little bit like, I don't know. I the day that I would repeat is the Harrods campaign that I did in 2020, when I was when I was shooting the commercial, because it was one of the most empowering moments of my life. And I reference that moment because it was so much more than a campaign for me. It was a moment for me where I felt like I had landed on my feet. It was during the lockdown, and I had a positive experience during the lockdown, because I finally got to work on myself and spend time with myself and self-focus, which is something, like I said, that I really need to do and don't do enough of. But at that time, I was really, truly so happy and so free. And it was the first summer after my top surgery. And to be included in the beauty campaign at that level, when I was bullied when I was really young for the way that I looked, to that be, empowered and free and doing something that cool that I could have never have dreamed of doing. That was a pretty cool day. That was my favorite day.
That is so cool. That is brilliant. What's a saying you live by and one that you'd put in the bin?
A saying that I live by is go big or go home whenever I do anything.
I
Um,
like that. And I'm just going to say to you, and Marty has naturally come up a lot in this conversation, right? Because mutual friends, and I know that Marty's your bestie. When Marty was talking about you, Marty said that you're one of the persons that shaped her the most because you never feel that there's nothing you can't achieve.
wow.
So
Wow.
that ties into very much you do go big.
Yeah, like with anything. And that's just so lovely that she said that. Like I feel like yeah, I always think like the bigger I just think on a macro proportion. I always think of like there's nothing to stand in our way from doing anything. And I love that kind of mentality. Firstly, because I've got ADHD, so it keeps me stimulated and and
Yeah.
it gets me excited and it gets me proactive. But also it's true, right? Like the only people that set limitations are ourselves. And I know that obviously sometimes there are difficulties and barriers and things that stand in our way, but I always want to kind of really aim for the most that we can get out of something or the most that we could do with something because especially as trans people, I think that there are so many limitations and so many barriers and so many things we carry on our shoulders. And actually, I really want to believe that we will overcome it all and we will do great things. And I believe that we can do that. And Marty, by the way, is paving the way and doing just that. I mean, look at what they've done with Trans
Yeah.
History Week. It's
Yeah.
incredible. And I don't
Yeah.
think there'd be anyone that could have carried off something to that standard. Like,
Yeah.
I'm so proud of them. So if anything, Marty is showing us all
Yeah.
how it's
Yeah.
done.
And again, Marty credited you with actually like kind of really showing Marty that they could do this. So, it's there's a lot of mutual love
Bless.
between us
I
all.
was a bit, I feel like a bit of an arsehole sometimes because I'd be like, no, do it even bigger. Go, no, 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 no,
No,
no.
no, you are such a motivating and encouraging person, even for things that I've been doing and you've kind of like been championing me like you are. The saying that you'd put in the bin.
Sticks and stones don't break my will break my bones, but words will never hurt is the most rubbish thing I've ever heard. Like,
What a load of bollocks, right?
right, yeah, words will never hurt. Words hurt.
Yeah,
Words traumatize us. Words can devastate people, and words can kill people. So that is not.
absolutely.
And this whole like freedom of speech thing, let's all be hateful.
Yeah,
It's a dangerous attitude to have.
yeah. It's a
There's
privileged attitude to have, and freedom of speech is not freedom of consequence. And unfortunately, when you spout this shit, the consequence is that people get hurt.
Yeah, entirely. And I love how people, well, I don't love, but the people that say that then can't take it either. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah,
they want
yeah,
to hear you, but they want to say what they want freely.
yeah,
And also, there's a difference between freedom of speech and hate speech. Like hate speech,
absolutely.
I feel no way. Like, and punching down at groups that are vulnerable and powerless is definitely not the way to go. So,
Punching down is definitely rooted in that idea of sticks and stones, right?
yeah.
Isn't it? Because it's kind of like, oh yeah, it shouldn't hurt. Like I'm just having a joke. It's not funny though. It's not
Absolutely.
funny. No.
And it comes from somebody that does not have that experience, that has far more privilege,
Mm,
and they're punching down to, people that have probably that have to carry so much more than taking a joke, you know. These jokes kill people. It's as simple as that,
yeah,
they perpetuate discrimination, hate, and violence, and people that make them need to take responsibility for that. And
100%.
yeah.
100%. What has been the best adventure of your life so far?
Um, I mean, my transition, this recent side of my experience has been, the most freeing, liberating, and best experience of my life. I mean, I wish it was an experience that I'd had much sooner, if I'm entirely honest, because, I'll never be rid of a lot of the trauma that I, wasn't acknowledging, which was the dysphoria. It was not living as my true self, constantly trying to mold myself and feel uncomfortable, and actually I didn't even know that I was uncomfortable until I went through the medical side of my transition, and the sigh of relief, the sighs of relief that I experienced, the more and more aligned I became to myself, that I became aware of a discomfort I didn't even know I was carrying for so long. So I wish I'd been supported sooner, but it's certainly been the most liberating time in my life. And it's opened my eyes to so much more than just myself. Like it's shown me, how the world functions and how dysfunctional everything is and how conditioned we are by, so like societal norms and stereotypes and all kinds of things. So it's been very enlightening, but an amazing and incredible adventure.
I remember before I met you, and I obviously kind of came across your profile and who you were and stuff. And your Insta handle is Becoming Jude, right? And just thinking that was so simple, but so powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. And someone said to me, "Are you going to change it into like being Jude?" And I thought, well, no, because I'll never stop becoming me. Like this journey is never going to end, right? And actually, again, aligning to my true self is so much more than just about transition on a
Mm.
physical level or in terms of my identity. It's become much more than that. And I think that's what I was alluding to when I was talking about like, finally being myself, and now there's so much more to deal with as myself for the first time. Like becoming my true self and becoming truly authentic is knowing, how to speak up for myself in a situation. It's how to implement boundaries. It's knowing what's mine and what somebody else's. It's being authentic and being your true self is so much more than just my, transition for me.
And ongoing.
Mm.
Love that. What three words would you use to describe you and your origin story?
Shame, empowerment, and liberation. Yeah, I feel like that's like my A, B, and C.
Is it a route that is as clear cut as going from one to the other?
Um, I think it kind of just like it describes the journey in a really simple way. Like I felt a lot of shame, and that was due to either the trauma, the bullying, my experience that I was carrying with me, and not being honest about that and trying to change myself, and then, empowering myself by being myself and learning what that means. And then over time, that has set me on a course of liberation and true freedom. And so I think, yeah, I think it describes it in a very simple way, but it's far more complex than that as well.
Let's fast forward a little bit. What exciting things do you have coming up? And I know we've touched on some of them.
Projects and campaigns as per usual. Every Pride Month, every June, it's like it feels like it's the strike while the iron's hot kind of month, because it's a month where, right, we celebrate the LGBTQIA plus community, not just as a community, but like everyone. hopefully this year.
Yeah.
And so it's an opportunity to really kind of launch campaigns that are specific to us. And so I'm really going to do that. I've got amazing, I'm working with Jake Graff on a photo series that we're doing, which is Trans is Human. We're humanizing trans people by talking about their human journey, not just their trans journey, which I think is so important, especially at a time that trans people are being dehumanized and vilified by the media, by, we're hearing it a lot, by our politicians as well. And we just don't see and hear from enough trans people. And so that's the aim. So we're aiming to amplify these trans stories and people, these people, which I'm really excited about. And of course, I'm thinking of positivity projects and how we can really amplify more support and love for the trans community right now, because so much is happening, especially for kids. So there's another project underway that I'm currently working on, where I'm focusing on how to do that. So that's what's coming up. And trying to just kind of get through, I think so many of us are struggling at the moment financially with work. Not just because we're in a recession, but also because, we know that there's been stalling when it comes to representing trans people. Like I've
Hmm.
spoken to so many big influencers and people that had so much work that are just not getting any. And
Yeah.
we've spoken about the fact that actually I believe that the stalling is coming from, all these attacks that are being made to brands,
Yeah.
things like that. And I think brands and businesses are scared to work with us at this very moment in time. And that, of course, is impacting trans careers. And so, we're kind of carrying each other through and having conversations about that at the moment, hoping that things will get better. And I'm hoping they will too. And obviously, there'll probably be another campaign that will hopefully focus on it as well. I don't know. So that's what's coming up. But it kind of feels like a bit of an uncertain time right now. Like the world feels quite unpredictable. And so we'll just have to see, I suppose.
Any rest time coming up?
Oh God, I hope so.
Make
It's
sure you factor it in. Factor some in,
Yeah,
Jude. What brings you
absolutely.
joy? What brings you joy?
What brings me joy? Do you know my friendships bring me joy? So I've done a bit more socializing, spending time with friends, eating nice food, watching films, chatting, watching stupid cat videos. Cat videos seem to be
You
my
love a cat video. You also a ginger cat video.
I know orange cats on video. Like I've literally
Yeah.
gone, I'll do a load of work and then I'll just scroll through TikTok watching funny cats, and me and Liz will send them to each other, and that's become a way that I unwind.
That is joyful. That is joyful.
Yeah,
That love
winning and
that.
laughing, right? Like
Collect collective resilience and ginger cats.
exactly. Orange cat's
Right.
got
Oh,
orange
and
cat.
raccoons. Don't forget raccoons.
Oh, you see, I went off raccoons. I've kind of
Okay.
I'm a one animal person, so it was raccoons and it was capybaras and now it's orange cats. But I'm sure there's another animal on the
Okay.
horizon.
I love it. Um, let's take it serious for a second. What takeaways do you have listening for anyone wanting to carve out a career in inclusion or just do something that creates an inclusive space?
Know that you can do it, number one. I know sometimes it feels like goals can be unattainable because of, A, B, and C. I can't do this, or I'm not good at that. Well, everything in life we learn to do, right? And I have built up a career over the years, and it's not been plain sailing necessarily. Like I said, I'm going through a bit of a rough patch at the moment. Um, but I believe that that rough patch will improve and eventually things will pick up again. Just to kind of, face the fear and do it anyway, right? The acronym of fear, we either let it stand in our way or we face it. And actually, there's something so empowering about doing the things that we're terrified of. Like, I was so afraid of opening up as a kid, like, not just as a kid, but like when I first entered like my first treatment center, couldn't even speak to people. And I've gone from that to public speaking for a
Yeah.
living. So actually facing my fears has been a very empowering experience for me. It's been very interesting that I'm doing things that I was terrified of, and actually showing myself that I can do them. And so we can move past that fear and that shame, and especially the shame stuff. That's been incredible. Like I remember being so terrified of telling anyone about my sexuality, and yet here I am, like being a proud trans person, like not caring what people think. And actually, that's so wonderful. So we can move past and we can change those experiences within ourselves. So that go big, go home mentality, if you can carry that with you and let it excite you and drive you, and just, whatever hiccups and barriers stand in the way, not to let them, define that experience, but just to keep going. I think that's the difference between kind of, people that enter finally manage to kind of fulfill what they want to do versus people that sometimes, I mean, and that's a very broad statement to make because actually, it's not easy for everybody, and we all have different experiences and come from different backgrounds and abilities. But for me personally, that, I'm just relentless. I continue hustling, and I ensure that I keep going no matter what. And that to me has helped me in so many ways. But if you wanted to become a public speaker or anything like that, I was talking to somebody yesterday about, what the first steps are, creating a LinkedIn page, thinking about what you want to talk about and what you would like to focus on, developing a talk, perhaps a presentation, a breakdown of that, and just, looking people up and saying, this is me, and so many of us are talking on just our own experiences as well. And I believe that everybody has a story to tell, that anyone can be a speaker really, because we all have a story.
Jude, I've absolutely loved listening to your story. Thank you so much for joining me on Pause and Rewind. I'm really grateful that we got to spend this time together, and I can't wait to see you soon.
Thank you, Neil. Lots of love.
What a conversation. It was brilliant to hear Jude talk about how the three words they'd use to describe their origin story are shame, empowerment, and liberation, and moving from those quite simply from one to another to bring out who they are. And when we talk about, Jude's the best adventure of their life so far, and that being their transition. And as I said, I absolutely, when I first became aware of Jude, I loved their Insta handle, Becoming Jude, and how Jude quite clearly says that they're still on a journey to becoming Jude. And it's just so beautiful. I hope you felt the absolute love that I have for Jude in that episode. I really do. And the work that they're doing is so crucial right now. So please take away the fact that you can make a difference to trans lives as well. You can be part of a movement of trans solidarity, because trans people have always been here and trans people are loved, and you can't argue with those things. So give Jude a follow. Please like and share this conversation with anyone you feel might be interested, and thanks for tuning in to Pause and Rewind. Be back soon with more amazing conversations. Cheers.